The Marines on the hill learned to count. Not the days left on their tour, although they did that too. They counted the gap between the thud of a distant gun and the moment the shell arrived, because that gap was the only warning system they had, and on a bad day, it was about 4 seconds. For most of 1967, a few hundred United States Marines held a low red hill 2 miles below the demilitarized zone in South Vietnam. They were shelled, day after day, by guns they were forbidden to chase and could not reliably silence. That autumn, it became the most closely watched piece of ground in the war. Time magazine put it on the cover. CBS built a half-hour primetime special around it. That was 1967. Today, most people who know a great deal about the Vietnam War cannot tell you what happened there. The hill was called Con Thien. In Vietnamese, Con Thien, which translates roughly as the Hill of Angels. And the thing that broke men who had already survived hard fighting elsewhere was not the number of ground attacks. It was that for weeks on end, there was often nothing on that hill worth shooting back at. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. Con Thien is not much of a hill. It rises about 160 meters out of flat coastal scrub, close enough to the demilitarized zone that on a clear day you could stand on it and look into North Vietnam. That was the whole value of the place. Artillery observers up there could watch North Vietnamese movement across a long stretch of border and call fire onto it, which is why, in 1966, Con Thien got attached to one of the strangest projects of the war. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had approved a plan to seal the border physically, using cleared ground, minefields, sensors, wire, and fortified strongpoints. The press called it the McNamara Line. Con Thien was its northwestern anchor. The Marine Corps hated it. General Robert Cushman, who commanded Marine forces in the region, later described the barrier concept to Marine Corps historians in a single word: stupid. That is recorded in the official monograph on Con Thien by Colonel Joseph Long, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps had opposed the project from its earliest days as well. The objection was practical. A fixed barrier meant putting Marines in fixed positions, in the open, inside enemy artillery range, and leaving them there. It was noted, and it was overruled. By the spring of 1967, engineers were bulldozing a 600-meter wide strip of bare earth across the countryside. The Marines called it the Trace. Seen from the northern bank of the Ben Hai River, it showed exactly where the Americans intended to stand and stay. The North Vietnamese tested it early. Just after 4 in the morning on the 8th of May, 1967, the base absorbed roughly 300 rounds of artillery and mortar fire in minutes. Then, 2 battalions of the North Vietnamese 812th Regiment came through the wire with Bangalore torpedoes and flamethrowers. The date was not an accident. It fell one day after the 13th anniversary of Dien Bien Phu, the siege that destroyed the French army in Indochina in 1954. Somebody on the other side was making a point. The garrison was small and mixed. 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, plus Special Forces, South Vietnamese troops, Montagnard Irregulars, and Navy Seabees. The fighting went through the bunker lines in the dark, and it was over by 9 in the morning with the attackers thrown back out. The official Marine Corps history records 44 Americans killed and 110 wounded. Notice what that tells you. Con Thien was attacked, penetrated, and held, all before breakfast on a single day in May. And that was the last time anyone got inside the wire, which brings us to the detail almost every popular account of this place gets wrong. The worst of Con Thien was never really about ground assaults. The 2nd of July, 1967. Company B of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines pushed north up a dirt track called Route 561, sweeping for North Vietnamese mortar teams. At a bend the Marines called the Marketplace, 2 enemy battalions were waiting in the hedgerows on both sides. What followed was not a firefight. It was a killing ground, pre-registered for artillery, with flamethrowers turned on men pinned in the open. Colonel Long's official account records the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, losing 84 men killed and 9 missing that day. Staff Sergeant Leon Burns, who won the Navy Cross there, said afterwards that only 27 men of Company B walked out. Other published accounts put the day's dead at 86. Either figure leaves the 2nd of July as the worst single day the Marine Corps suffered in the entire Vietnam War. The operation that grew out of that ambush was called Buffalo. Official casualties across its 12 days run to 159 Marines killed and 345 wounded. A North Vietnamese figure is attached to Buffalo as well, and it is worth handling carefully. The claim is 1,290 enemy dead, and it comes out of the American body count system. At the marketplace, the counting was so difficult that men resorted to counting abandoned canteens, and Marines who fought there later described figures swelling as they moved up the chain of command. Treat every North Vietnamese casualty number in this story as a guess produced by a broken method. And that was only round 1. Because the thing that turned Con Thien from a bad posting into a national story was not infantry at all. It was what sat on the far side of the Ben Hai River. American intelligence estimated roughly 130 artillery pieces north of that river, a figure recorded in the official Marine Corps history of 1967. Among them were Soviet-supplied 130mm and 152mm guns, with a reach beyond 10 miles, alongside rocket and mortar batteries. Those guns were dug into cave positions. Crews rolled them out, fired, and rolled them straight back under cover, and they sat inside the demilitarized zone or north of it, and ground American troops were politically barred from entering on foot for most of that year. So work out what that means for a rifleman on the hill. You are being killed by a weapon you can hear, but cannot see. Worked by men you are not allowed to walk toward. Sighted where your own guns can shell the general area, but almost never destroy anything specific. The Marines answered the only way available to them, with volume. They massed roughly 180 artillery tubes along the demilitarized zone, including long-range Army guns firing from Camp Carroll and layered naval gunfire from the 7th Fleet on top. It suppressed. It did not solve. Meanwhile, the hill itself was coming apart. Con Thien sits on red laterite clay, which in the monsoon turns into a heavy, sucking mud that fills trenches, floods fighting holes, and makes sanitation more or less impossible. Reporting from the neighboring Strongpoint that autumn, Time magazine described bunkers holding 2 feet of water and mud. A 19-year-old Marine quoted in the same piece described rats landing on men while they slept. And the bunkers, the one thing meant to keep a man alive, were not reliable. On the 7th of July, 1967, a single 152mm shell punched through 5 feet of sandbags, loose earth, and 12 by 12-inch timbers into the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines Command bunker. 11 men were killed, and the battalion commander was wounded. Here is a Marine describing that experience himself, on camera, at Con Thien, while it was still going on.
How does it feel to be down in your bunker with all of that artillery coming in?
A little bit shaky. Me, I'm a natural-born chicken.
We understand back home that this was one of the roughest places in the war. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would. It is. It's pretty bad up here.
Could you tell us about some of your experiences since you've been here?
A lot of artillery incoming rounds and mortars. There's not much you can say about it.
Have you had some pretty close calls?
Not too close, but pretty close. I'm still here.
What do you do when you hear those rounds coming in?
You get out just about as fast as you can. Then after they slack up a little bit, you find your hole. You keep your head down.
How long have you been here?
36 days.
In Vietnam?
4 months.
If this is the kind of history you want more of, primary sources first, and myths corrected out loud, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. That is the whole ask. Now, back to the Hill. By September 1967, the bombardment hit its peak. The official Marine Corps history records at least 200 rounds a day, landing on the base through much of that month. Between the 19th and the 27th of September, Colonel Long's monograph records more than 3,000 rounds striking Con Thien. On the 25th alone, roughly 1,200. American return fire across that same 9-day window shows how lopsided the exchange really was. Marine artillery fired 12,577 rounds. The 7th Fleet added 6,148. Marine and Air Force aircraft flew more than 5,200 sorties. All of that, and the guns in the caves kept firing. In late September, the photographer David Douglas Duncan helicoptered onto the Hill for Life magazine and ABC News. Duncan was a former Marine who had covered the Pacific and the Chosin Reservoir, so he was not a man who impressed easily. He worked alongside Mike Company of the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, and he described lying in the dirt listening to salvos walk closer in 50-meter steps, doing the arithmetic, and understanding that the next one was theirs. 4 words. We were target zero. Duncan's photographs ran in Life on the 27th of October, 1967. CBS had already given the base half an hour of prime time, presented by Mike Wallace, with field reporting by John Lawrence on the 1st of October. Time had run its own piece in September, under the title The Bitterest Battlefield. For about 6 weeks, Con Thien was the most famous place in the war, and the frame nearly every one of those reports reached for was Dien Bien Phu. It was an obvious comparison, and it was largely wrong. The North Vietnamese effort in the north was directed by General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of Dien Bien Phu, and Western commentators assumed he was running the same play a second time. General William Westmoreland ran the comparison in the other direction, characterizing the outcome as Dien Bien Phu in reverse, and arguing that massed firepower alone had broken a siege. Both readings missed the same thing. Con Thien was never Dien Bien Phu, because Con Thien was never actually cut off. The road up from Cam Lo was harassed constantly, and in early October, the monsoon washed out a crossing badly enough to drown a Navy corpsman. But it was reopened. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft kept flying in. Whatever the newspapers were printing, this was not an isolated garrison being strangled. It was a heavily supported position under sustained bombardment, which is a different and far less cinematic thing. The American answer was also something the French at Dien Bien Phu never had. On the 11th of September, Operation Neutralize began, an air campaign directed by 7th Air Force Commander General William Momier. Air University's published history records B-52s flying 910 sorties against gun positions north of Con Thien. Total air sorties across the campaign ran to roughly 4,000. By late October, the shelling had tapered off with the weather. On the 22nd of October, General Crichton Abrams ordered all work on the McNamara line halted. The barrier Con Thien had been built to anchor was never finished. So let us be exact about what this place was, because the internet is not. Con Thien was not overrun. The only penetration of the wire was the 8th of May attack, and it failed. Con Thien was not abandoned, and it was not lost. Con Thien was not fully encircled, and the round counts you will see quoted online, 150,000 shells and figures like it, do not appear in any official source I was able to check. What is documented is heavy enough without inflation. Across the full battle period, Marine Corps records give a total above 1,400 Americans killed and more than 9,000 wounded. One battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, dropped from a strength of 952 men to around 300 across 2 months, and that figure folds together the killed, the wounded, and the men who simply could not do it anymore. That last group is the one the records handle worst. There is no reliable published figure for psychiatric casualties at Con Thien. The men described it in their own language instead, and the phrase that stuck was time in the barrel. 3 months after Duncan's pictures ran, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, and 2 weeks after that, the siege of Khe Sanh began. Khe Sanh got the isolation, the airlift, the scale model in the White House basement, and the permanent place in public memory that Con Thien had held for 6 weeks and then handed over. Which brings us back to those Marines counting seconds between the flash and the shell. They were not forgotten because nothing happened to them. They were forgotten because for a short stretch of 1967, an entire country watched them do it, and then found something louder to look at.